Oye, mi gente, Ish here, and with the holidays happening, we all know that we're about to get caught up in tremendo corre-corre. But that doesn't mean you can't enjoy something delicious while running holiday errands. There's only one solution for awesome Cuban food that's fast. You know we're talking about Cuban Guys restaurants. With 5 locations in South Florida, yeah, even one in Broward, there's no excuse to eat anything else when you're out and about. Beyond exhausted after Black Friday shopping all morning, swing by a Cuban Guys for pan con tortilla y por supuesto un café con leche. Hungry after waiting in line for hours to pick up el lechon? Have some Cuban Guys fritas and un batido. The kids están jodiendo on the way to Tia Gloria's house? Pop in and grab a cubanito sandwich for them while you enjoy the Cuban Guys sandwich. Cuban Guys restaurants lo tiene todo, and you can dine in or order ahead for pickup or delivery. Así que visit cubanguysrestaurants.com to find the nearest location and start enjoying the awesome Cuban food you deserve this holiday season.
Hey everyone, this is DJ.
And this is Ish.
And this is Season 5 of Pero Let Me Tell You.
Hey, mi gente, Ish here. Now, you know if there's one thing we love on Pero Let Me Tell You, it's food. We make no bones about that. We're fatties. We love to eat. It's what we do. And within that world, if there was a Venn diagram of what one of our favorite things in the world to eat would have to be a sandwich cubano, the Cuban sandwich. So, of course, when I found out that there was a book about the history of the Cuban sandwich called The Cuban Sandwich, A History in Layers, perfect title in my opinion, I had to have the author, but to my surprise, it was 3 authors. So we have with us today Barbara Cruz, Andrew Hughes, and Jeff Hauk from the authors. I mean, from the Cuban Sandwich: A History in Layers. Thank you, all 3 of you, for joining. You know, I think this may be the first time I've had 3 guests at once. I think the most we've ever done is 2. So congrats on that record breaker.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
So I'm just gonna jump right in. I mean, I'm a Cuban-American boy from Miami. Before I even had recognition of life, I knew what a Cuban sandwich was. If I didn't know it by name, I knew it was this thing that existed. What led the 3 of you to say, you know what, we need to write the history of the Cuban sandwich? Like, what was the genesis of this idea?
I guess I'll take this one.
All right, Andy.
I sort of became designated as sort of an expert a long time ago in the mid 2000s. But long before that, I was really interested and sort of obsessed too. Was interested in Tampa's kind of food history, and really over time that just deepened. And so the fact that people had so many questions about it sort of just kept nudging me in that direction. And then I happened to have some friends of mine, some colleagues who were similarly obsessed. And so I thought I could do it on my own and it would take a really long time. Or I could, get some help and we could get a book out there sooner rather than later.
Work smarter, not harder.
And and just a lot better too, because, it's way better than it would have been if I had taken 10 years to do it. Unfortunately, the pandemic happened, so there was no travel involved or anything like that. But that maybe we'll save that for another project. But anyway, Jeff and Barbara were instrumental in sort of linking the history that I was researching with the present and people who are kind of doing it in the here and now.
So you were more the historical, like you had that itch scratched and you're like, okay, how do we bring it from a history into the present day? And then that's where Jeff and Barbara stepped in?
Absolutely, right.
Cool. And how did that go about, guys? Like, was it more like, okay, let's divvy up I'm going to write this chapter and you're going to write this chapter? Or was it, let's get together and make the decision of, a timeline where we're going to take this as a through line?
Well, I think that each of us brings a different, component to the mix. We bring something different to the party. And like you, Ish, I'm Cuban American. I was born on the island, raised in Miami, spent most of my life in Tampa. And so I know that I have un pedacito de sandwich cubano somewhere in my DNA. I'm sure of it.
Well, it happens
And
to all of
so-
us. The minute we eat it, it just sticks there. It's the Cuban bread.
That's right. That's exactly right. So I bring that to the mix, and certainly my native language is Spanish, and so some of the archival materials that we reviewed and that we found were not just in Spanish, but in Cuban Spanish. You know what I'm saying, right?
That is a very clear distinction that must be made. Our listeners know, but it deserves to be repeated. Yes.
Well, and also a century-old Cuban Spanish. So there's lots of slang, etc. Right?
Another layer.
Exactly right. Yeah, exactly right. And then we also did a number of interviews of craftspeople, of artisans of the sandwich. And they were certainly from around the state of Florida, but are also in various parts of the United States, in Las Vegas, New Jersey, but also around the world. And in some cases, the interviews that I did, it was so interesting because just about everyone is bilingual, but yet somehow or another, when they tapped into the very deepest recesses of their memories about the Cuban sandwich or their family making the Cuban sandwich, they would switch into either Spanish or Spanglish, right? Absolutely. And then that's where also Jeff comes in, because he'll tell you a little bit about his background.
All right, bring it home, Jeff.
I hear a lot of pressure after that setup. No, I was a food writer for the Tampa Tribune for a number of years, and I saw how people lived their life through the sandwich and what it meant to Tampa from a cultural standpoint. Got to know it as I covered more and more of the food scene in Florida, obviously what it meant around the country, but specifically South Florida. And, there was always a great sort of undercurrent of ours is better no matter where you went. And I thought that was compelling. But even better is, it's about a sandwich, but the sandwich alone is not the story. It has great ingredients that have stories with them, but the stories are really the people who made them, how they got to where they were. The compelling history that Andy and Barb researched showed that, it had wartime and migration and cultural, shifts from one place to another. And it was definitely true with the current practitioners. The Cuban sandwich, they say religion and politics are the third rail. The Cuban sandwich is the third rail of food. And if you don't make it correctly and you call it a Cuban sandwich, you will know very quickly. It's sort of like if you spell the word conch correctly, but you pronounce it conch, you will be hung in effigy in Key West. So there's little things like that in Florida. The Cuban sandwich means something different in both parts of Florida, but there's a similar passion. It just has a different ring on the tree to it. So I was happy to kind of show who current practitioners were, who sort of some of the chefs then and their stories of how they came to use it. But I work for the Columbia Restaurant Group, which has been in business in Florida since 1905. The oldest restaurant in Florida, oldest Spanish restaurant in the United States. And even they have a story after all this time. So being intimately familiar with it on the inside, and then actually, what I saw before I joined the company, how could you not want to be a part of this project? I tell my wife all the time, I'm like, I can't even imagine if this book was out now and I wasn't part of it, the rage and jealousy that would course through my veins right now, because it's such a great book. I'm like, I can't believe I got to be a part of it.
You would be one upset gentleman. I feel it, like just the way you talk about it. You'd be like, how dare they not include me?
I would be on the news in some fashion. I have no doubt about it.
So I definitely want to talk about like the more recent, the new crop of Cuban sandwich makers. But, I want to pick up on something that you said, the passion that so many in Florida feel about the Cuban sandwich. I mean, in all fairness, there was like less intensity in the rivalry between the Sharks and the Jets than there is between Tampa and Miami over who created the Cuban sandwich, right? But what I was struck by is just how global this story really is. I mean, because again, it would have been very easy and or lazy, really, to kind of be like, well, Tampa, you know, it's the birthplace. It hurts me to say that, but it's the truth, you know, as far as the U.S. goes, right? You know, Tampa's birthplace, and Miami, you know, has a Cuban community, and kind of just take it from there. But you guys went really, really far back. I mean, in a sense, giving us, you know, a greater history of the sandwich in a cultural context that was crazy to me. I mean, I've never seen more old-timey letters by women who are organizing lunches talking about how to eat a sandwich in my life, and I love it. God bless all three of you for finding those documents.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is like I said in the introduction, like it's like radically reductive the way that it's been treated. I think in kind of written language, that like Alton Brown, for example, he'll spill I don't know how many words about what he thinks about sandwiches when he came to town, but his recipe takes up that much space. It's 4 lines, you know, and I think it's 4 or 5 lines, and there's no history, there's nothing attached to it, you know, and that's what I think is one of the real failings of food writing as we know it, or we've known it in the past, because it's been changing really fast in the last 20 years. And so for me, it was really important to not just write a book about the Cuban sandwich, but kind of the life and times of the Cuban sandwich and this deep context, because always before it was like, you know, like in the 80s or 90s, if an article was written, it was like, well, the Cuban sandwich showed up around 1960, you know, and came, you know, and showed up
As
in
if
Miami,
by magic.
you know, and it's sort of like, whoa, you know, it just, it's so jarring in that it just lops off everything that came before and everything that made it what it is, you know, up to that point. So for me, that was mission number 1, was making sure that we had that context, you know.
Yeah, and I think another interesting thing, and maybe, you know, maybe Barbara, you can speak to this a little more, or on a relatable level, is the Cuban sandwich. And I'm not trying to get too deep here because that's not my style, but it's almost like the immigrant story, right? Where it's just like it made its way over here as in one shape or form, and then the longer it's been around, the more it can evolve. And, you know, I'll stick to the Cuban American of it all. You know, a Cuban American in Miami isn't the same as one in Los Angeles, isn't the same as one in New York, because ultimately, you know, you are shaped by your surroundings and your environment. Would that be a fair, you know, assessment? Again, if we're taking that 30,000, you know, mile from a view from above.
Absolutely, it's a fair assessment. I mean, the Cuban sandwich is a story of migration. Excuse me. It's a story of diffusion, of cultural diffusion, of starting with the mixto in Cuba, right? Literally mixed, and having this combination of meats and cheese. And, you know, in our research, we found that chorizo and salchichon and pavo and all of those kinds of things were used in the sandwiches as well. Probably, you know, kind of going by way of Key West at some point as well, certainly in Tampa. You know, lots of times we forget that the largest Cuban enclave in the whole United States was in Tampa. Until about 1950s, and certainly after the Cuban Revolution, you know, we see the huge influx of immigrants, Cuban exiles into Miami. And then the Miami Cuban, you know, morphs it yet again. The bread is different. Certainly, it doesn't have the Genoa salami. Siempre por la plancha, siempre. Yep. And so, you know, it's just like a different feel. And what we have found is that it continues to evolve. So we talked to folks. One of my favorite interviews that we did for the book is a gentleman who was born in Cuba, kind of goes by way of Latin America. A young woman from Ireland is there, falls in love with her, follows her to Northern Ireland.
Oh, wow.
And basically sets up a Cuban sandwich shop in Belfast, Ireland, Northern Ireland, which is still there, operating, really popular. And, it's just this beautiful story. And of course, he has to make do with what he can find. Cuban bread is, that's tough. And so he has.
It's hard to get it in New York, much less Northern Ireland. I mean,
that's exactly right. We interviewed one in New Jersey, and he has a particular Cuban bakery, in New Jersey that he can tap into. But that's going to be different. It's just like folks who debate the merits of the dough for pizza made in New York City. It's going to be different than Chicago, and and all of that. So everywhere you go, it's a little bit different, and we love them all. We're equal opportunity Cuban sandwich eaters.
I gotta say, I mean, as I was reading them, I was like, well, they all sound good, but it's weird because, again, you're the result of your experiences, right? When I read with turkey, I'm like, no, that's an Elena Ruth. Like, no, thank you. I know where that one goes, right? So bringing it, to the modern, more recent world. I'm gonna direct this actually to Jeff. You've got some great interviews in there. I mean, a lot of. I don't feel. It feels right to call them some iconic, restaurants and interviews. I mean, from Sergio's to, Betsaye to our friends at Sandwich, Danny and Rosa. I mean, Gilbert's. The list goes on and on. What would you say? You made a mention that everybody kind of puts their spin on it, but what would you say is the through line? Right? Like, no matter how modern it gets, no matter what the spin is, that the Cuban sandwich ultimately has to retain in order to have that recognition. I mean, aside from the bread, right? I guess we can all agree the Cuban bread, or else it's just, wheat on, like ham on rye. But what is that through line that kind of makes everybody agree, okay, this is the Cuban sandwich?
Sure. Yeah. And I should say that Barb and Andy contributed to those profiles as well. Andy did the Sandwich one, and Barb did the Belfast ones, and others as well. We kind of tag teamed on it. I know everybody gets hung up on ingredients, and I don't know if my colleagues agree with this. I think ultimately when, as we were describing, when people move, they take their foodways with them. And sometimes they can replicate and sometimes they can't. And when they can't, they assimilate and try and use whatever they have. I don't think there's anybody sitting in Florence that would recognize the chicken parm. Is it reminiscent? Yes, it is. I don't think anybody in Italy would say that noodles came from Italy and not China. Everything moves and everything goes with it whenever people migrate. But I think
Olive Garden is not authentic. What?
Listen, I'll eat the hell out of breadsticks any day of the week. You don't have to convince me. Anyway, my point is that I think whenever you see the sandwich move, it's not about the ingredients. It's about the experience of eating it. Is it crunchy? Is it salty? Is it sweet? Does it have a little bit of mustard on it? Is it tangy? Is it creamy? What are the different kind of flavor profiles that people associate with the experience of eating it? That's why, okay, if you can't get Cuban bread and you can't make it, you know what? If you have ciabatta, you'll use ciabatta. Is it the same experience? No. If you eat it on a baguette, is it the same? No. It's like having a food fight with your mouth. I mean, it's so heavily different. But it's about the combination of those flavors and textures that makes a Cuban sandwich to me. I know people will argue and they'll say, no, it shouldn't have salami on it. And, thank God for Andy and Barb because they found, salchichon. Salchichon had been on it on the island.
That was crazy to me.
And so when it makes its way to Tampa and there's all these Sicilians here, of course the Sicilians are going to go, why should I go buy salchichon from that guy when I got my Genoa salami here? And so I'm not saying that was the argument or that's how it made the leap, but wherever it goes, it assimilates and adapts. And, in Tampa, it was Sicilians primarily who made the Cuban bread. There's one bakery in Ybor City that was owned by the Ferlita family, made 35,000 loaves of Cuban bread a week. And the houses in Ybor City had a nail on the outside that you would literally impale the bread on the outside of the house. Miami doesn't have that story. It's a different level. It's a different thing. but each place it goes, it adds a different thing. You know, Barb found the gentleman in Belfast. There is a restaurant in Seoul, South Korea. It's called the Tampa Sandwich Bar. And they make a Tampa Cuban, they make a Miami Cuban. The whole menu is about American comfort food. There's macaroni and cheese, there's all kinds of different things. But they also make a Korean style one that has kimchi on it.
A kimchi Cuban sandwich.
And you would think that would be crazy, but when you think about the mustard and the pickles on it cutting through the fat and the mojo and the pork, it's brilliant. And they came to Tampa. I found them on Instagram. I made friends with them. And then I sent them a bunch of Tampa artifacts. I am the only Caucasian to send rice to Asia. I know Barb and Andy have to be tired of this story, but I sent La Bomba Paella from the Colombia and all these Colombian artifacts. But their inspiration was the Colombia restaurant Cuban that they found online. And like, okay, how do we make this? But the fact that it wasn't a Miami sandwich bar, it was a Tampa sandwich bar, was significant to me.
Without even visiting, they were like, this is the inspiration. Like visually, they were like, this is what we.
It's a total food baby of the internet. And so, yeah, again, what was it that was appealing? Well, it said that, number one, even though it was a Cuban sandwich, it's an iconic American food. And so we can have ethnicities within America that are identified with that. You know, and it's a sandwich that comforts, it fills your belly, you know, and it hits so many different points on the flavor and texture profile that to me is what the real appeal of the sandwich is.
Yeah, I would have to agree with you in the comfort food area of it, because I lived in Queens for a couple of years, and there were times where I would order either a Cuban sandwich or even a medianoche, knowing that bread-wise, I was going to be disappointed. I knew it wasn't going to happen. I knew what I was getting myself into, but when it came through, right, like that comfort of like, okay, but this still tastes, right?
Does it taste like a Philly cheesesteak if it's not on an Amorosa roll? Yeah. Is it better on an Amorosa roll? Yeah. So it's like, you know, we all set our expectations no matter where we dine, no matter what we eat. Some are a little more rigid than others, and it sort of became codified by the passion in Miami. You know, I think it's safe to say. You know, when in the book I interviewed Michelle Bernstein, who's an Argentinian chef, well known in Miami. She doesn't make a Cuban; she makes a mixto, because if you make a Cuban, there are certain expectations in people's heads, and if you don't hit those expectations, you're screwed. That is essentially the tactic of a lot of people, where they're like, mixto allows me to play. Cuban sandwich is like, I have to measure 2 bits by 2 bits by this, you know.
Yeah, and that's why she's
I don't know any other sandwich too that has to be cut a certain way. I mean, Barbara will tell you that. From long way from corner to corner. Mm-hmm. You know, so there's a lot of things. I've even saw research where it's got to be on a certain kind of plate. I mean, it's really, really deep. So,
that's a little much. The plate is a little much. I'm cool with it just being on, you know, a regular Dixie plate, paper plate. I'm fine. It's okay.
Right.
So I want to bring something up that, you know, and again, I've been reading The Cuban Sandwich: A History in Layers. I'm about halfway through, so I probably am more on the historical side than the more recent side of things. But something that we mention on our show a lot that is a little bit of a pet peeve for us is when people refer to the Cuban sandwich in English as like, oh, I'm going to order a cubano, as opposed to saying like, I'm going to order a Cuban sandwich. Because it's one of those things where myself and my co-hosts have always said, it's like, we've never walked into a place and been like, you know, and again, we are Cuban, we are Spanish speakers, right? Walked into a place and been like, you know, do you guys have a cubano? Like, no, nobody says that, right? Like, generally speaking, you know, we'll say un sandwich cubano or a Cuban sandwich. Have you found that that's just have you found that happening, or is it just us that we're annoyed by like the 3 people we've heard? And if you have, why is it happening? Like, and can we stop it?
So, because of course, I know exactly what you mean, by the way, Ish. I know exactly what you mean. When I first moved to Tampa, one of the things that freaked me out is that I would see these signs on the sides of the, as I'm driving down the street, it would say hot pressed Cubans. Like, what do you mean hot pressed Cubans? Oh my God, what are you doing here?
I feel like you should move, Barbara. You should move. It sounds dangerous if they're pressing Cubans. Yeah.
For real. And so I thought that was a little odd. And this idea of the cubano, un cubano is a human being, is a person. And so we don't, do it like that. But in Tampa, certainly, and in a lot of other places, they definitely do it that way. You go with the flow. You go with the flow.
Well, the other part too, there's a great story in Tampa. There used to be a sports editor named Tom McEwen at the Tampa Tribune, and he wasn't just a sports editor, he was like a kingmaker. And when the Tampa Bay Buccaneers changed coaches one time to Tony Dungy, they picked him up at the airport, and Tom says, okay, I have to make one stop. I have to pick up 7 Cubans before we get. And Tony had no idea. And Tony's like, this is a pretty small car. I'm not sure where everybody can go. And sure enough, Tom goes, stops, gets sandwiches. He goes, oh, okay. And it was like his baptism to Tampa. Chinese food is not Chinese food in China. It's just food.
True. That's a very fair assessment. Yes, absolutely. That's great. Yeah, I guess I had never thought about it because we're applying, that to us, a cubano is a person, not a sandwich. So that's a very fair. Thank you for explaining my thoughts to me, Barbara. Like, I hadn't even stopped to think about it, so I appreciate that. So as we're wrapping up, okay, we don't shy away from controversy on this show. Based on your own personal opinions and your research, does salami belong on a Cuban sandwich or not? I know. It's as controversial as talking about Israel and Palestine. I know. But I don't know who wants to go first.
I mean, I like them any which way, really. I mean, honestly, I've had lots of great ones with salami, and I've had lots of good ones without salami. So I'm either way, as long as it's good.
So yesterday I was at a workshop, and we were talking about Cuban sandwiches, and this young woman told me that she remembers exactly the first time that she had a Cuban sandwich in her whole life, and it was in Atlanta, Georgia, of all places. And she was going to college, and she had her first boyfriend and whatever, and she said it was a little old lady who made them on the side, and it was the best Cuban sandwich she had ever had to this day. I think that context matters. Absolutely. I think that environment matters. And, when I go to Miami to visit family, and I think about, someone asked me the other day, do I remember the first time that I had a Cuban sandwich? And first of all, lots of folks don't realize that for most Cubans, we didn't have Cuban sandwiches at home. It was something you got up when you went out, right? Either at a restaurant, a sit-down restaurant, a diner, or at a ventanita. La ventanita. And so when I would go, I remember when I went with my dad, that is probably, who has since passed, that Cuban sandwich that I remember cut on that sharp diagonal con la puntica that you can dunk into the café con leche. That is awesome. That is this taste memory that is just so strong and so warm and so comforting. But I got to tell you, I moved to Tampa as an adult. And when I go to the Columbia restaurant, or when I would go to the Silver Ring, or I would go to La Tropicana, a number of places, the savoriness of the Genoa salami and the bread from La Segunda Bakery that is crusty on the outside and soft on the inside and it's delicious. That is awesome.
That bread from La Segunda, I have had bread from La Segunda. It is next level. It is next level, that bread.
So you see what I'm saying? And so depending on where you are and who you're with and what your goal is that day.
Or night. Right.
That's true. Or night. It could be, most likely it's after a night of dancing that you're swinging by Betsaya at like 1 a.m. You need something to settle that stomach.
There are very few things that are as good an airbag for your liver than a Cuban sandwich at like 1 a.m.
I'm going to turn that into a t-shirt, by the way. That's a great quote. few
Yeah,
things.
I echo what Barb and Andy say. I wish I was more discerning. I think fighting over food and ingredients is a first world problem.
Fair enough.
And as Barb said, no one's fighting over this in Cuba.
Right.
And as Randy's research showed that more than one protein is a rich man's sandwich at a certain period of time in history. So, I think we're all very blessed to have whatever the hell we can get on the sandwich. I've had convenience store sandwiches that when I'm trying to get between point A and point B, it's not my ultimate experience, but guess what? It's a Cuban. I've had it with mayonnaise. Not going to turn it away. It's just I feel so fortunate to be able to have it where we live.
Right.
That I remember when I lived on the other side of the country and we didn't have them. You kind of miss them a little bit. So be happy for what you have is my message.
All right. I have to say I agree with the three of you. I mean, at the end of the day, I just like food. So I'm not going to turn, nobody will ever come to me with a Cuban sandwich with salami, and you will never see me be like, no, thank you. That has salami in it.
Right.
And if you've ever seen me do that, I've been replaced. That's consider that the warning sign, the code, the code for that. But I just got to say, again, everyone, the Cuban sandwich, A History in Layers. I mean, the book is great. The name is fantastic. The three of you are wonderful. The picture on the cover is enough to just make you salivate the longer you look at it. And I say that as somebody who's looking at the cover, so I make sure to get the name right. And it is I just had lunch. Why am I hungry again? Because I'm looking at this cover. It's just that damn good. But, thank you. Thank you for taking the time to chat with us today. But more so than that, thank you for writing this book. It's one of those things that on the surface, somebody sees it as the Cuban sandwich. What's the history? Okay, somebody woke up one day, was hungry, put some stuff together, right? But it's not. It really is a love letter to food, to the Cuban sandwich, but also it's a history lesson. It talks about so much of the history of Cuba, of the U.S., of Spain, of, just the entire Caribbean. And it's one of those things where, you kind of hit it within the layers, right, of the book. The vegetables are in there, but it's a very delicious way to get to it. So thank you, all three of you, for this fantastic book.
Thank you. Let's hope, by the way, that the sandwich makes it back to Cuba, because I think that would be exciting to see. That would be a symbolic move of epic proportions.
Talk about full circle.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, I'm off to go because I live 2 blocks from Bedside, so I'm just gonna go grab one right now. And again, it's the three of you's fault that I'm about to gain 5 pounds is really what it comes down to.
All right. You're welcome.
That a couple extra little pounds is always good on a Cuban.
This is true. Well, it's because we're hot and pressed. That's why. Like the billboard said. Yeah. Thank the three of you so much yet again, and I look forward to maybe one day, hanging out in person and sharing a Cuban sandwich together.
That would be
Thank
great.
you.
Likewise.
Take
Look
care.
forward to it.
Thanks.
Bye.
Pero Let Me Tell You is co-hosted by Darian Borges and Ismaeliano, produced by Ismaeliano, and our theme, Pero Let Me Tell You Freestyle, is composed by Michael Angelo Lomlaplex, the official gay guy. And don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes.